Kwe, welcome. My name is Andre Bondsman. I'm the Director of Indigenous Initiatives and Board Governor at Algonquin College. I'm pleased to be here today to open today's event, Creating Safer Classrooms for Black and Indigenous Learners, as part of the Taking a Stand Disrupting Black and Indigenous Racism Week. This week is an important part of the ongoing efforts involving many members at Algonquin College community who are committed to the conversations and actions required to address racism in all its forms. In particular, I want to thank Angela Lorette and Misa Mendez Kobayashi, who worked to coordinate this session. I am pleased to be able to sponsor this event on behalf of our office, the Truth, Reconciliation, and Indigenization. This topic is especially important because all our classrooms must be safe for all Black and Indigenous learners. However, anti-racism and inclusion efforts don't stop at learning events. Let me take a moment to share other ways the college is working to make sure Algonquin is a place where everyone belongs. Specifically, we are working this week to raise funds for the James McNulty Bursary, which is given based on financial need to an Indigenous, Black, or New Canadian practicing nursing student. If you are able to support these learners, please take action and make a gift. The donation link is in the chat. We are diversifying general education and degree breadth courses and hope open a call for proposals inviting faculty to suggest courses for development on the topic of Indigenous culture, reconciliation, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have Save a Seat for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, BIPOC, employees with leadership aspirations in our employee mentoring program. Employees are invited to express interest now for our 2021 program. You'll find more details about the efforts on the Taking a Stand website. Before we welcome our speakers today to take us further into conversation, I want to acknowledge that I'm opening this event on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. Algonquin is working towards reconciliation, and this acknowledgement is just a small reminder of the large commitment. With this in mind, the college respectfully gives thanks to the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people for hosting us on their ancestral land, Miigwech. With those thoughts shared and a willingness to learn, let me properly introduce you to today's insightful speakers, Entong Ader and Gabrielle Fayant-Lewis. Entong is an Ottawa-based policy analyst, producer, and writer. She has a passion for science, sports, and storytelling, and works with the Federal Black Employee Caucus to address issues of anti-Black racism within the federal public service. She holds a Bachelor of Science honors in neuroscience and a Master's of Journalism from Carleton University. Entong recently shared her experiences in an article for CBC entitled "The Unexpected Costs of Journalism School for a Black Student," and was part of the group of BIPOC students and graduates who penned a call to action for institutional change in their journalism program. Gabrielle Fayant-Lewis originates from Fishing Lake Métis Settlement, Alberta. Gabrielle is an award-winning woman for her work in her community, youth empowerment, and Indigenous rights awareness. She has worked with several Indigenous and not-for-profit organizations and is currently the co-founder and co-CEO of Assembly of Seven Generations. A7G is an Indigenous-owned and youth-led not-profit organization focused on cultural support and empowerment program policies for Indigenous youth while being led by traditional knowledge and elder guidance. Today's discussion will be moderated by Sasha Leduc. She is an online student pathways advisor and professor at Algonquin. Prior to working at the college, she worked as an employment counselor with marginalized clients in the community for over 5 years. Sasha holds a Bachelor of Social Work from Carleton University, and she is a student at Athabasca University studying in the Master of Education in Distance Education program. Sasha is passionate about promoting inclusion in online and classroom environments to ensure that all students belong. Welcome, Atong and Gabrielle, and I'll leave the conversation to you now, Sasha.
Thank you, Andre. All right, so let's start our discussion today. So the first question I have is for both Gabrielle and Atong. How do Black and Indigenous students create a support network? How do others support this network? Gabrielle, would you like to go first?
For sure. I just wanted to acknowledge everyone for bringing us onto this discussion, and to acknowledge the territory that Algonquin College is located on. It's unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And the way that's been described to me by Algonquin folks is that it's like a really nice way to say that this land is on occupied territory. So it's really important that people understand what unceded and unsurrendered really means. It's not just lip service, but it actually is really significant to the folks that live on Algonquin territory. There was never a treaty or an agreement for any of the settlers to live on this land. So really important to acknowledge that. And um, yeah, like a few ways that I think that Indigenous folks kind of find networks, or some advice that I could give is, just number one, like find people, find folks that you can trust and that you can rely on. Like really, what I try to do is I match my values to people in my support circle. And you know, it doesn't really matter what background they come from. It doesn't have to be an Indigenous person looking for another Indigenous person necessarily. Sometimes that just happens organically, but it's really about like the values that your peers carry. If you can trust them, if you can rely on them, that's really, really important. But also, it's important to seek those supports, but understand that it has to be a reciprocal relationship. It can't just be, oh, I need this, and so I need to take from this support circle. But what are you willing to give back to that support circle? Definitely, check out the student services on your campuses at Algonquin College. When I was going to Algonquin College, they didn't exist. And so, there's a lot of awesome folks that will help you out and help navigate some of the barriers that exist in institutions. But I also wanted to acknowledge, that just because someone is Indigenous doesn't necessarily mean they're a safe person. So be really diligent. Don't trust everyone. Question people. And within the Indigenous community, it's taken quite a long time for us to start calling out problematic behavior. And it's happening more and more now, which is a good thing. I think it's scary for people that are upholding problematic behavior, but it's a good thing for those of us that are trying to be safe and keep our peers safe. So question people, challenge people, and yeah, find a group of support that you can trust and rely on.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Atong.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of echo a lot of the things that Gabrielle just said, but in my case, it had happened organically. It wasn't a strategic act of seeking out of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized students. It just so happened that those were the people who could understand what was going on, and beyond that, trying to function within environments that were never really designed with us in mind. But beyond that, to have the audacity to try to succeed in those same environments. So strategically, in terms of creating these types of networks, I think the first step is to find people who understand that common language of racism, and unfortunately that comes through experience sometimes. The ability, to look over at somebody if someone says something in a classroom and through a glance be like, okay, we're both seeing what's going on here, right? Like I'm not out of touch with what's happening. So finding people who have that common understanding of your situation. And then I think the other part of it is to find allies. But I've also, there are people who don't like the term allies, and I understand that because it seems quite passive. I've heard conspirators or collaborators, but whatever it is that you call that thing, allies have to be active. It's not enough to just show up. You need to do something, otherwise you're just a spectator. One of the institutional responses, and Gabby touched on this, has been to actually create the physical spaces for students to gather. Which is super important because that didn't exist when we were going through school. When I was going through elementary school, high school, grad school, is the first time that I ever saw that. And I think beyond that, I think you should also consider how these student networks, these Black, Indigenous, and other racialized student networks interact with the schools as well, right? Like, is the idea to have a network just to say that a network exists, or is there a way in which the issues that the students are facing gets addressed by the school? So I think it sort of requires a little bit more in-depth looking at how it's going to function within the institution itself.
Thank you. Yeah, when I'm listening to both of you speak, like I hear the shared experience of being like indigenous student, like in the post-secondary environment, the same thing as being a Black student in the post-secondary environment, that it's hard to navigate because the system's not necessarily like set up in a way that it's accessible for everybody. So like, I think that's really great advice that you're giving to, reach out, other people that have shared experience, but also like not just automatically trust people just because. I think that's really good direction. So next question I would like to ask would be, what are coping strategies students can use if they feel unsupported in the classroom to protect their mental health? And I'll start with Aton.
I think that's a really interesting question. To find ourselves in a situation where we're asking students to have coping mechanisms to survive in environments we don't feel safe in. I also hope that on the other side that there are elements being dealt with to make those environments safer. But from a stress response, what I can say is that what causes us stress as humans has changed over thousands of years, but the way in which we respond to these stressors has not changed. So for example, hundreds of years ago, you could be walking around and a predator spots you and sees you as, a very tasty meal. And you have a split second to make a decision, whether that's you're going to fight, you're going to run, or you're going to play dead. But any one of those options, if successful and like you're not eaten, it completes your stress cycle, right? You get rid of the thing that causes you stress, and then you're able to relax and then go on with your day. The issue is that the stressors that we're dealing with today are around us all the time. Whether that's homework, family stuff, relationships, work deadlines, projects, systemic racism. So the first thing I think is important is to understand how you yourself respond to stress. And I briefly mentioned it, but there are 3 ways to respond to stress. There's fight, flight, or freeze. I know my stress response is freeze, and it's consistent. Even an hour before preparing for this event, part of me was like, maybe I should take a nap. Or when I was, going through the Carleton grad program, and there were just days I would come home exhausted because my stress response is freeze. One issue is that people don't even recognize the signs of their own stress. So figuring out how you respond to stress can help you see the signs and then pull yourself out of that. The other issue, I think, is that we get stuck in the stress response cycle, right? So you have to find ways that are consistent for completing that stress cycle. And the research shows, and what's worked for me is just consistently exercise. I was never as fit as when I was in that grad program because I would, I knew 3 days a week I was going to go and that was going to start my day. But that was also a thing completely outside of school that I had control over and a sense of accomplishment. And it also helped, through the muscle tension and releasing, complete that stress response. It helped me sleep better. It helped me have energy and that sort of thing. There are other ways for people, particularly if you have like chronic, pain and you can't exercise. There's stuff like muscle relaxation techniques. Last thing I would say before passing off to Gabby is know what your priorities are, because knowing your priorities helps you set your limitations or your boundaries. For me, it's very clear that my priorities are myself and my health, whether that's mental and physical, my family, my community, and then everything else. So, if I'm faced with something at school, like a deadline or Study groups that often would say, oh, we're going to meet and study all night. My limitations for my own health were, no, I need sleep. And so I can't participate in this. So, understanding that stress is unfortunately a regular occurrence in our day-to-day life, but recognizing those signs within yourself and also knowing what your limits are to pull yourself out of situations before they become problematic.
Thank you. Gabby, would you like to add, please?
Yeah, I think one of the things I want to talk about regarding school and institutions is that the first experience that Indigenous peoples had with school was through residential schools. So schools and institutions are just inherently unsafe for us. And there's like a whole like blood memory that comes into play with it, just like we have blood memory that supports our cultural resurgence and ways of living. There's blood memory that warns us about unsafe situations. And that's how I always felt in school. I always felt like trapped. I always felt like really like nervous, anxious. I felt like I didn't have autonomy over when I could eat or when I could go to the washroom or when I could just take a break. And you constantly have people that don't even understand you or where you come from, or people that can't even comprehend what it's like living in poverty, forcing you to do things that you just can't do because of things that are going on at home. And so, when it comes to dealing with stress, like the way I understand stress is that stress is like Atong was talking about. It's like a daily occurrence. Everything, there's stress within your whole day, and that's natural, and that's part of being on this earth, like living is stress. But the problem is when stress turns into crisis. So when the stress has just becomes so unmanageable that eventually you have like a breakdown, or in a lot of the time in Indigenous communities, that stress leads to crisis, which leads to suicide. And so that's why there's such high levels of suicide in our communities, is because there's not enough knowledge or education about how to deal with these stressors, as well as just meeting basic human rights needs. So, I think about stress in that way, but some of the best practices I can think of, for someone that's going into a college or university setting and dealing with that stress is, just figure out what works for you and approach it from a harm reduction place. So what works for me might be totally different than what works for Tong, and both of those are equally valid. Neither one is better or worse. It's just how we deal with it. And so, be gentle with yourself and how you deal with stress. And there's really extreme ways that, mainstream society sees as extreme ways of dealing with stress, that some people might use. And that talks about alcohol and drugs and other things like that. And we have to just, give people informed decisions to get away from that lifestyle, but also don't judge them for how they're dealing with it, because you really do not know what they're dealing with at home, or or if they're grieving or any kind of things like that. Really understand your triggers also. So that takes a lot of work to understand your triggers, but once you start, sensing that something's triggering you, you could begin avoiding those places and those people that might be triggering you. And that's like kind of like a band-aid solution to dealing with triggers, but it's like a short-term solution until you're able to work through the trauma. And then the last thing I would mention to students in any classroom is that just because you're Indigenous doesn't mean that you should be the spokesperson for all Indigenous peoples. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. There's like hundreds of Indigenous languages, which means there's hundreds of Indigenous subgroups. Indigenous also is like a really big umbrella term that covers a lot of area for so many different cultures. But what what I was getting to with that point is that sometimes in classrooms, the teacher will point at you and say, "Hey, can you tell the class about all Indigenous things?" And, just put down your foot and say, "No, I can't." And participating in that kind of tokenism is actually a form of white supremacy and racism. So be aware of it, and you do not have to speak on behalf of everyone. That's so much responsibility and pressure that, you do not have to carry.
Tong, would you like to add to that before we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, Gabrielle touched on a lot of things that I think Black students are also dealing with. Particularly, I think we don't do a good job in this country of talking about our history. And, I can't really recall growing up or going through the education system in Ontario where we got what I would say, at least a very different perspectives of the history. They tended to be from first contact, right? And so that presents a very specific view of Indigenous people. But when you're talking about Black people, people are not really aware that slavery existed here for over 200 years, and the impacts of that, or that there are Black people who can tie their families, like their family histories go back hundreds of years, predating Canada as a country. And when you rob us of our histories, and before I move to that, I mean, and then there's also Black people who arrived here 20 years ago or 2 years ago, and the only thing that really binds us is the color of our skin. But people see you, and they just it's this sort of huge umbrella of like, oh, you're Black, and so I expect this from you, or the stereotypes to come. And the mental weight, and Gabrielle said it perfectly, of being the spokesperson. There's a certain level of freedom that comes with operating in an environment where you're not forced to be the spokesperson. And I can recall probably 2 experiences in my life where I was in a class that was predominantly Black, and the lightness of that, and not feeling like everything that you were saying carried the weight of people who looked like you. So I just wanted to add that, yeah, the long-term effects of mental health issues being ignored can lead, and often do lead, to crisis, which is why I started this question, or my response to this question being like, it's odd that we're asking students to come up with coping mechanisms when this is a systemic problem. So hoping that there are different levels to the response for this stuff as well.
Thank you. Can you please tell our viewers the unique dynamic at play in the classroom that can be challenging for marginalized students? Gabrielle, would you like to start?
Yeah, there's so many different challenges. Like that is one of them. I remember constantly growing up, like teachers always asking me to like teach about Indigenous histories and cultures. Well, they never even like worded it that way anyways. They were just like, teach about Indigenous people. And as like a young person, you're still trying to figure that out on your own. Because as Atong just mentioned, a lot of the history is never taught to us, especially urban Indigenous folks. We have to rely on the education system that's in cities and towns for our knowledge, and we're barely ever recognized in those books until very recently. So that's like a huge challenge. I think one of the other challenges is that even just to get to school is a challenge. Just to get into a classroom is a whole privilege. And I'm not even just talking about formal education, but I'm talking about in grade school, just to get to the classroom. And so, you know, I remember having to struggle to get to Algonquin College because I didn't have enough money for a bus fare, because I didn't have enough money for food, and so you literally have to decide, like, am I going to survive today or am I going to go to school today? And so obviously I'm going to survive today. So that means school is coming after. And so many schools and principals and teachers and professors don't understand this. Um, a lot of folks are so privileged, a lot of students are so privileged to have like really great support networks around them too. But when like a lot of Indigenous children come to urban environments from different communities. So I came to Ottawa from Alberta, for example, and like, so when I came to Ottawa, it was just me and my mom. And so when I was in Algonquin College, my mom passed away. And literally my mom was my only support. And I told my professors, you know, I was doing pretty good in school, and I reached out to my professors, even though I was dealing with this huge grief. And I said to them, you know, like my mom passed away. And, you know, like some of them were like, oh, okay, well, you can have like a week off. Like, that's so ridiculous. Like, even like 12 years later, I'm still trying to deal with that grief. Like, and in that moment, a week was nothing, you know, and there's just not enough understanding about the needs that Black and Brown and Indigenous children need, and young people and students in general. um, like we really have to approach the success of students holistically. It can't just be, oh, are you getting good grades, and that's all we base the success of students off of. It's like, okay, this young person is taking care of like 3 children, so maybe that's not why they're coming to school. So how can we support them in other ways? And then on top of that, there's like the learning as well. So a lot of Indigenous children and students learn in different ways. So many of us are like hands-on learners and oral learners, or audio learners, however you want to call it. But the written learning doesn't fit with most of us. It's like trying to create a whole other muscle in our brains that isn't there. Our muscles are really around like watching and observing our aunties and our uncles and our cookums, how they would do things, and making mistakes. You know, that's how we learn, is by making mistakes. Like imagine trying to write down how to chop wood. Like all of us would fail, but that's one of the skills we need, is we need to know how to chop wood. And so you got to watch and learn, and you're going to make so many mistakes. But the current education system doesn't have room for that. You know, it's just like, here's a test, you either fail it or you pass it. And that's the only way to move forward. So those are some of the challenges.
Tong?
Yeah, I think Gabrielle hit all of the points that I would hit. One of the things that I would like to say, though, is there's almost the subtle racism of lowered expectations. And, you know, one thing that I do recall is whenever issues of mental health would come up, there didn't really seem to be an understanding from the administration beyond a policy piece that's written in your syllabus. So what does that actually say about how seriously this stuff is being taken? The understanding compassion part, you know, Gabrielle just said they told her she had a week. I'm struggling to find the words to say how disappointing that is, because it happens so often. You know, that you're just not given the same level of compassion that you see afforded to other people. So yeah, not much else to add, but thank you.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next topic, or is there anything else that we want to add to this? Okay, thank you. We have read news stories recently where staff and students use racial language in an academic context. Can we discuss what language is off limit? I'll start with Atong.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this in a bit of a roundabout way by going back to the Carleton piece that I wrote. So shortly after that piece was published, the student who used the N-word actually reached out to me. And, you know, she said, I don't actually remember saying this, but people that I trust tell me that I said this. And so for that, I'm sorry. And I didn't really know how to respond to that. But to me, that was a lesson in power, and how easily people with power can use it without thinking of the impact of it. And whether we agree with it or not, the reality is that there are words have meaning. And sometimes that meaning, because of its history, can be quite traumatic and painful. You know, this student was able to say it and walk away completely unbothered and not think about it until was reminded years later. Whereas for myself, and I spoke with other Black and the Indigenous and racialized students in that program, we remember that moment, right? I remember where I was sitting. I remember, and the ripple effects of that is that I'm now sitting here having this discussion with you, whereas she completely got to walk away from it. So I think this discussion of language and what's appropriate and that kind of stuff needs to be sort of addressed on multiple levels, right? So there's the individual dynamics that were going on within that classroom of her feeling comfortable enough to say it, and how the other students around her, including the Black, Indigenous, and racialized students, felt about that moment. But there's the other level of that is also like the cultural level of that as well. And in the piece, I say, would a more diverse faculty have responded differently to that moment? The other part of that is is, would a student have felt so comfortable saying the N-word if the professor was Black? So you have issues of inclusivity and diversity within the institution itself. And then the other piece of that, I think, is an institutional response, which is, you know, saying we now have a zero tolerance on using the N-word or any sort of slur and that kind of stuff. That is a hard and fast rule, but if you don't have the other pieces, if you don't build the, you know, the cultural piece of the diversity that, I guess for lack of a better word to sanitize it, is a deterrent to students using that word. Or for the students in the classroom, it shows that people who look like them can be in positions of authority. Then the whole thing really looks performative. And so when we get into this conversation of what words can and should be used, I think we need to think about it on all those levels.
Gabby, thank you, Atong and Gabby.
Yeah, like I just wanted to acknowledge, you know, everything that Atang just talked about. You know, and I think that as Indigenous people, so much that we learn from like Black philosophers, Black educators. You know, it's really like Black folks that have said, this is not acceptable. Stop saying this word and stop saying other words like it. And so now I feel like Indigenous folks are coming to that place too. And we're coming to that place where, like, you know, stop saying the word Indian, like stop saying the word Redskins. You know, there's football teams with these names in them, and it's so hard for people that are non-Indigenous to even accept that this is problematic. But why would it, like, why should it be up to non-Indigenous peoples who are obviously not offended by the words to decide if it's harmful or not? If someone is telling you that the word is harmful, that's the end of the story. Like, just leave it at that and stop using the word. You know, stop using the word half-breeds. So that's like another name that people have used to describe Métis folks. And we use these words. We use these words when we interact with each other, and that's up to us. It's not up to anyone else to decide if we can use them to interact with each other or not. You know, and recently, even in Canada, even in Ottawa, there was like the Nepean Redskins, like that existed up until like just a couple years ago. We're not mascots, we're living, breathing people. You know, we're part of this society. And, you know, the discrimination is just like, it's so out of control. You know, and then I think about in Edmonton, there's a football team and like it's an E word. And so I'm not Inuk, so I can't even use that word because it's a racial slur for Inuit. And this football team, what they did is they did a poll to the citizens of Edmonton to ask them if it was offensive or not. Like, the Inuit population is so small in Edmonton. Why would these non-Inuit people be able to decide if it's offensive or not? But yeah, like I really have a lot of love for, you know, so many Black folks that have showed us what setting boundaries looks like, what calling out inappropriate behavior looks like. And I feel like Indigenous folks, you know, we're getting there, but even to get there, we're still trying to explain to non-Indigenous folks why it's offensive. And then I'm sure, you know, once we get there, we'll continue to learn from like your experience too, Atong, and, you know, other students like yourself.
Thank you for sharing. I want to add, like, as a diverse faculty member, one of the norms that I set in my classroom is the importance of language and what is acceptable in my class. I identify as a Black mixed woman, and that slurs or language that is not sensitive towards other people of color will not be tolerated in my class. You know, I've been very fortunate that that has not happened in my class, but that is something as a person of color, I feel like I need to set that expectation in my class to create a safe classroom for myself, and then for also the BIPOC students that I have. And I've had my students tell me, like, thank you for setting that expectation and creating that moment. So I really appreciate that. You know, like having you like bring that up and, like, you know, calling upon the institutions to like set that norm, because that is really important in ensuring the safety of our learners and our students. All right, so we're gonna move on to our next question. What strategies can students use if they experience or witness microaggressions in the classroom? And I will start with Gabrielle.
Cool. So I'll kind of like break it into two answers. One for like the folks that are experiencing the microaggressions, and the rest of my answer will be about the observers. So some strategies, I could think of three really important ones, and I'm sure there's so many more, but you know, there's safety in numbers, you know, and so Atong was mentioning about that earlier too. You know, how like me and Atong went to junior high together, and went to high school together, and we were friends, and in our crew, it was just like a whole bunch of like mixed people. Like there was Black students, there was like, I was probably the only Native one, but but there was like Latin folks, there was Filipino folks, like, you know, we just like all kind of merged like in a group together, and that's how we kept each other safe. And so there is safety in numbers, you know, and I think that it's okay for students to acknowledge that, you know, if people start to question like, oh, why do you only hang out with those people, or why do you only sit with these people, it's like, because it's safe, you know, and you can be really firm about that. And on the flip side, I really want to challenge teachers to stop separating groups of people, you know, that are going like merging together for safety. So, you know, when I was in junior high, these really, really formative years of your life, the teacher separated us all. And so I ended up having to sit beside this angry white boy. And I had nowhere to go. I was stuck sitting beside him. And he would lean over and whisper in my ear and say things to me like, oh, you're so ugly, and like you're so dirty, and all these things. And I just had to sit there and take it. And you know, that kind of traumatic event, it sticks with me to this day. You know, like 15 years later, I still, you know, have this self-doubt about who I am because of these comments. And so don't separate don't separate students if they're comfortable around certain people. You know, they're probably in that group setting because it's for protection, it's for safety, it's to avoid situations like that. And then also, like, we usually end up like supporting each other financially as well. So we end up sharing resources, and so it's like a whole like little network that really needs to be valued a lot more. Some other things is just know like you're not alone. I know that systemic racism is, and just racism in general, it makes you think you're alone. It makes you think that you're like abnormal, or there's something wrong with you because you don't fit into this mainstream narrative. But you're not alone. There's so many others that have similar experiences and share similar cultures, and find those people and nourish that. The other thing I would say too is that sometimes you have to decide when you have to walk away. And so I actually dropped out of high school. And I left high school because it was not safe for me. Um, I have so many like really horrible situations that happened to me in high school. So many teachers really didn't care about me. It was really, really hard. And I don't want to get into all those stories, but sometimes Indigenous students will leave, and it's a choice of safety. It's not because they can't do the work or they don't have the ability to do the work. It's because all of the other things around are not making this situation safe. And then on the flip side, if you are an observer and you're witnessing these things, one thing I'd really, really recommend is bystander intervention training. It's really simple training. It's training that everyone should have. And it just helps you like learn how to step into these situations. And on top of that, really learn about your power and your privilege, and also your proximity to whiteness, and where you fall within that. Because say if I was getting harassed on the street, I really wouldn't want someone else with less privilege to get in the middle of that either. So that's really like, we look to folks with a lot of privilege, like this is your time to intervene. Like a white male, like this is your time to intervene in this situation. And so step up to it. It's so many times things get unnoticed, and then we have to sit and deal with that trauma. So I think I also have some roles and like strategies for institutions, but I'll get into that in the next question.
Yes. Thank you, Gabby Atong.
Yeah. Before I get into my answer, I do want to, I agree fully with everything that Gabby said, particularly that students will leave. When I was going through the program, I talked to a lot of the Black, Indigenous, and other students, and at different levels, at the undergraduate level, and so I knew what was going on. But I don't have the numbers, but anecdotally, I could see that some of them were dropping out of the program. And when I would ask a question, or later when I was having a conversation with the administration, I would say, well, do you know why these students are leaving? I knew why, because I was talking to them, but they didn't know. There was no follow-up to ask those questions. And often the sentiment is, oh, they just couldn't cut it. Whereas, you don't really talk about the compounding effects of what it's like to also try to deal with all the systemic issues that you're dealing with and try to get an A in a program, or try to meet a deadline at the same time that you're essentially doing free labor, because that was, that's the basis of journalism, these free internships. And if you have to decide, are you going to work a part-time job when they tell you not to work part-time? So there's sort of these trade-offs, but understanding why it is that your students leave is very important, because it helps you get to the root causes of that stuff. One of the things that Gabby said, I'm looking at my notes from when you were speaking, safety in numbers is really important, and it triggered a memory for me. And what that is just like trauma bonds, right? And I'm reminded of very, very early in the program, in the grad school, we went and covered the 2016 US elections. And this was like, the rhetoric was against women, against people of color, and against journalists. I had 3 strikes against me, and my friends as well. And we go 45 minutes out of Ottawa, and you see Confederate flags, and I didn't understand what was going on. But that one day, because we spent something like over 24 hours, we got there at 7 in the morning, stayed the next day, and all the stuff that came with that bonded us, because we would be covering something, or something would happen, and we'd look to see each other's safety. That is how I planned my day. And then when we got back to Canada, to Ottawa, we sort of got together and just like had a meal. And for the first little while, it was just silence. It was just like, we could breathe. And so there is that, safety in numbers is very much a real thing for me when I was also going through school. Talking about the microaggressions, one way I've heard it sort of explained that's a little easier to grasp is that microaggressions or macroaggressions, it's racism plus ignorance. And racism is structural. And I keep coming back to saying, like, we're giving strategies to individuals to deal with structural problems. And so I just don't want us to get away from the fact that racism itself it's structural. You can think of it as traffic. You can think of it as a stream, and you're a car or a fish, and you're trying to go one way, but it's forcing you to go another way. And the ignorance part sort of builds into that structural piece, right? So you have structures that are racist, and as has repeatedly been said in reports, the UN report in 2017 came out and said, despite Canada's reputation for diversity, structural racism lay at the heart of all our institutions. The ignorance part is the history. Why are things the way that they are? How did we get to this point? That's what leads us to a point where micro and macroaggressions are sort of everywhere that we see or experience. If we don't address the structural issues, we're just going to keep seeing them manifest over and over again.
Thank you. I think this is a good segue to our next question is, how do we foster environments in class or on campus that create safe space for Black and Indigenous students? Atong, would you like to start with this, please?
I think it starts at the top, which is why a group of students and myself got together and did that call to action. There needs to be a very clear message that there is zero tolerance for this. And then the culture, it takes time to change the culture, but you also need to put in the positive stuff. So if using the example of the classroom from the piece that I wrote, if there is to be a zero tolerance policy, all of a sudden, there is sort of, an institutional response to that we don't accept this. But again, you cannot have the institutional response without the cultural shift. So it's are the people in the positions of authority, reflective of the diversity of the students or of Canadian society at large? Do they know how to deal with racism as it manifests? Because all of us can sort of, I think, pick out the glaring symptoms of, or like the glaring examples of racism, someone using the N-word or that kind of stuff, but the subtle ways, the lowered expectations, the expecting certain students to not do as well, or do you need ESL, or where are you from? Here, where are you really from? Those types of conversations, and it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts. So do the people who are representing the institution, are they learning, and do they know what they're doing? And then it sort of trickles down to when these situations come up in classroom, it's like, no, we don't have, that doesn't happen here. And the education piece, but because a lot of this stuff is not limited to one institution, it is endemic in all our institutions, our education system needs to catch up. We should not be learning, like I shouldn't have had to learn about Indigenous history after I left school. I shouldn't have had to learn about Black Canadian history after I left school. So how are we dealing with this? And there are things that I think you can do, whether that's making certain lessons or courses mandatory as part of schooling, but to sort of get at that ignorance that ties to that racism and sort of perpetuates the cycle that we're in, it needs to have multiple strategies for going after it. Yeah.
Thank you, Atong. Gabby, please.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking about too, like when I was in grade 7, I was considered a gifted student. Me and Atong were in this like gifted students class.
Yep.
It was actually really fun. We got to like leave class and like do little like random things with like petri dish.
Oh yeah, projects, the light. Yeah.
Like I don't even know what we were doing, but I was just like happy to get out of the other class. But that to say that like I'm an example of an Indigenous person that is intelligent, that is capable. I was considered a gifted student. And I I have the abilities to participate in school and any other form of learning. But as Atong was mentioning, you know, it's not looked at like that. I was just looked at as like a high school dropout eventually, you know, and the statistics are so focused on like why indigenous children are so bad and why they're, you know, not making like the cut and all these things. And another reason why that happens is that the researchers that are looking into these problems are not reflective of the populations that they're trying to do research on. So I'm always a big advocate for more diversity in research, more diversity in even creating surveys and stats and, you know, like analysis of these things, and having a much more like in-depth approach to analyzing these things, because that's the only way you're really going to understand the problem is if you listen to folks from those populations. And so some other things that I was thinking about too is that I really feel like institutions have to move past, you know, this cultural sensitivity or cultural competency training. That's like a really great one step. But like, let's be honest, like there's a whole staircase we got to get through. It's not just one step. And so, like, let's move into accountability now. You know, what happens to those folks that have gone through all of the cultural sensitivity training and still, you know, are using racial slurs, are still being really problematic? What happens to them? Because right now, I still see them on payroll. So, you know, let's move beyond like the lip service and let's actually have accountability and justice. Um, that's really, really important for me. I think that, you know, institutions are really quick to like indigenize things. And like, I think that's great. Like, I love seeing like indigenous artwork on the walls, or like, I love like, you know, there'll be like a drummer that comes in and an elder, and that's really awesome. But it's almost like just putting a band-aid over like an infection, really. And like let's actually heal this wound instead of just putting more and more band-aids on top of it. And so a part of that for me is really trying to decolonize institutions. Like I said, I believe that institutions are inherently racist, but I still think there are ways to make them less harmful. And so let's look at that. Like let's move past like the symbols and the good words, and you know, let's create as safe a place as possible for all students. um, so that's kind of like one of my big pet peeves I see like institutions and governments always doing. um, it's just not enough. You know, it's not tackling the root of the problem. And then I think another note is that when institutions are looking for elders, they often are actually finding like elders or knowledge keepers or spokespeople that are like really safe. They're also often not people that the community has appointed. It's kind of like it's almost like an institution has appointed certain people in these roles. And so what does that actually mean? And that means that sometimes these people are causing more harm within the indigenous community. And because they're appointed by these really powerful institutions or governments, they just keep being put in these positions of power. Meanwhile, like they're homophobic, meanwhile they're racist, you know, meanwhile they're anti-Black, and you know, the list goes on and on. But because they're in this position of power that they've been put there by institutions, there's no accountability for them either. And then institutions feel like they can't hold these folks accountable because it's like the indigenous person that is the spokesperson again. So it's like this really sick cycle. But one of the things that institutions can do is create a community-led vetting process. And it's really, really important. The amount of times we see um, like predators come into Indigenous spaces, and just because they're Indigenous, like literally sometimes they just say I'm Indigenous, and they're getting access to like classrooms, they're getting access to really powerful positions, and that's like the only criteria. But it has to go beyond that. You know, what is this person? Do they actually have the qualifications to be a safe person, to be working with really vulnerable people? You know, we have to create safer communities, and that means also the Indigenous community being more proactive in vetting and making sure that the right people are in these positions.
Thank you both for your insight. As we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add or bring up before we move on to the Q&A?
No, I'm good.
Gabby?
No, I think are good to move on.
Awesome. Oh. All right. Sorry, I opened like more than one chat box now. Let me close this and open the right one. All right. After learning about the history of our people, and in your point of view, do you also feel angry? How can I deal with the anger in a proactive way?
Who is that one for? Both of us?
It's for both of you. It's not directed to anybody.
I think anger is a natural human response. My approach, I think because I'm quite calm and soft-spoken, sometimes people don't think that I experience anger. To go through systems that are quite oppressive and try to figure out ways in which to deal with it can induce anger, and it is a regular human response. It's what you do with that. You know, anger can be quite destructive, but it could also be quite, you know, a powerful force for doing things. You know, it can move people to be like, I don't like the way things are. What can I do? But I think the danger in getting stuck in anger is that it kind of corrodes you from the inside out. So find a strategy to channel that anger into something a little bit more, you know, useful to you. And it doesn't need to be productive. And I deliberately did not say something productive because I think you need to center yourself, particularly when you have this emotional response, because often your emotions are ahead of where you are mentally. They let you know. You check in with yourself, and it tells you what's going on. So I wouldn't necessarily shy away from that anger. Recognize what it is, understand where it's coming from, and then decide what it is that you want to do with it.
Yeah, I think you know, just coming off of that, I really feel like anger has been, you know, morphed into like a bad thing, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I mean, you know, for example, when we saw uh like that incident in the hospital with Joyce, and you know, this woman had to videotape herself dying. And, you know, of course, that's anger. Like, you're gonna feel really angry about that. And if you don't feel angry, then, you know, you're probably part of the problem. So, you know, use that anger, like, you know, and I'm not saying like use it like in violent ways, but use it to like spark that fire, to mobilize, you know, to be passionate. And you know, it's like a that's how I see anger, is like it fuels your fire in a little ways. I wish we didn't always have to be so angry though, you know, and I use my anger to kind of bring me to that place of, okay, I'm gonna be angry, but I'm doing it because I hope eventually the next generations won't have to live with this anger, you know, that, you know, it'll bring the next generations a little bit more peace. And so that's how I kind of use my anger, and that's how I try to like channel it, I guess. But I also use it as a passion. I use it to keep me going and continue to push me, to even look at my own privileges and hold myself responsible and accountable as well. Um, so yeah, I hate that narrative of like I get it all the time, like that angry native lady, and people actually like push me out of spaces because of it and all these things. I think it's also important to realize like what does who do we call angry? You know, you don't usually hear like anyone talk about an angry white man. And there's a reason for that. You know, it's usually like a woman, and it's usually a woman of color that is considered angry. Um, but you know, our feelings are totally valid, and just remember that you're all of the things you're experiencing and feeling is very valid.
Mhm. And can I just add one last thing? Calling us angry, whether that's angry Black women or whatever your experience, can also be seen as a silencing tactic. So just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. That's a really great point. There's a question that I saw come up on the Q&A, which I think I know we're a little going over our time, but I think this is a really good question, so I will ask it. What do you think a person should do if they're close friends that keeps calling them rude words against their culture or skin color?
Do you want to start, Gabby, or should I start?
I would just say like get new friends.
That's what I was gonna say.
I don't know, like it kind of goes back to my point in the beginning, like find people that have the same values as you. That's your support circles, like people that you have shared values with. And you know, if people can't even come to that bare minimum amount of respect, like you know, they don't really deserve your energy.
Mhm. I think one of the ways people look at things is, oh, what am I getting out of this? I would look at that situation like, what is it costing me? You know, if you're interacting with someone you consider a friend, and you know they're denying your history, and you can't really talk to them about your experience, what is the cost of that friendship to you? And no one can really answer that other than you.
Thank you. All right, there's another good question I want to ask. Last one, I promise. What is some advice you give to other racial minorities who are trying to be allies and stand up to anti-Black, anti-Indigenous folks within their own culture?
Okay, this is a good one. It's important. My advice is, you know, keep doing it. It's important to be specific. Um, and what I find is sometimes people are uncomfortable with calling something anti-Indigenous racism or anti-Black racism. You know, they want to be inclusive with their racism, so it's all types of racism. And the reality is, the numbers, if you're looking at it purely from an analytical perspective, show that Black and Indigenous, you know, don't fare very well when it comes to education, health, interactions with the justice system, employment, and all this kind of stuff. So specificity is important. And there's this thing, sort of like the visible minority masking, when people, you know, some people are just coming to this conversation recently, you know, with the George Floyd incident over the summer, and people are starting to look internally. So there's I think an element of trying to figure out what's going on, and it's easy to put everything under this visible minority category. The danger in that is that it masks the experience of Indigenous and Black folks, and sort of pulls it and makes it seem like it's everybody's, you know, in that grouping situation. But what sometimes we're finding is things may be fine for other groups that look, you know, that subscribe to that visible minority category, but you need to be specific to Indigenous, to Black, because the manifestations of racism in those two experiences are quite different than other visible minorities.
Gabby, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, like it's a really big question, because I think it's so like kind of like coming from that specific piece, it really depends on like what the person's background is, and um yeah, and like exactly, and like what kind of racism we're talking about. But one thing that has always worked for me is just meeting people where they're at. And so you have to decide if you even want to do that because that's like a whole amount of energy and resources that even comes with that. But like for example, friends in my life that were like Egyptian or Filipino or like Haitian or Somalian. And I feel like there's kind of like different conversations that go with each group, and you try to find similarities with each group. That's kind of something that's worked for me. And it's so cool too when you find similarities, and I feel like that helps demystify things and breaks down barriers. And then on the flip side, like there's a lot of there's a lot of racism within Indigenous communities, and Indigenous folks aren't, just because we're Indigenous doesn't mean we're not racist, and so we have a lot of work that we also need to do. And being Indigenous doesn't give you like a free pass to be racist or participate in racism. And I think that's something that I'm always trying to work on. And like if it wasn't for like all the different cultures that I grew up with, like I wouldn't be here today. Like, at my house, like I was going home to like craft dinner and hot dogs. Like that was my meal. Like that's how poor we were, and if it wasn't for like the Filipino ates that fed me, I would have been so hungry, literally, and because I didn't have much food growing up, I would eat like anything they served me. And so they really loved making me food, like because a lot of their children wouldn't eat like octopus or like the things, and they'd be like, ew, that's gross. But meanwhile, I was like, I'll eat whatever you're cooking. So yeah, like food I think too is such a good way to start. Food and sharing about cultural songs and dances has always been a really cool starting point for me.
Thank you. Would you be open to taking a couple more questions? Yes. Okay. Just making sure because I want your permission. All right. Sorry. I'll have all these boxes open on my screen. There's a lot of questions. Okay. Sorry. The joys of technology. Thank you for your patience. What would you like your professors in post-secondary to do to create more supportive and safe classrooms? I heard you say not separate safe groups of students, which I'm happy to do. Do you have any other tips?
I think it would be nice to have profs who looked like me. That would go a long way.
Gabby, do you have any tips that you would like to share?
I think that, something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, like we want to talk about, equity and inclusion and all these really great words, but that often means that people that are upholding privilege and power need to make some sacrifices. And it means sharing the power, stepping away from spaces that you shouldn't be occupying, being really, really aware of those, like I think of like all these Indigenous, like there's so many different names for them now, but like Indigenous study courses. And like a lot of them are taught by non-Indigenous people. Like, what the heck is happening? Like, let's get some Indigenous knowledge keepers, experts, teachers into these positions. And, like and the thing too about that is that there's so many opportunities for non-Indigenous folks to take up, and in particular white professors. There's so many opportunities, and like you can literally go into a university or college and like count on one hand how many Indigenous professors are in the whole entire school. So we have to be really like critical about that, and that means stepping away from power and giving up power.
Thank you. All right, this is our final question. What advice do you have for the young BIPOC and Indigenous First Nation people who are the leaders of the future?
I would say, and this is going to be, I'm blown away by how vocal students are, way more than I was, that Gabby, than when we were growing up. You just sort of had to sit there because there's this notion, particularly like my family came here in the early 90s, and with the immigrant mentality, it's like whatever your teachers say is law. So you sit there and you listen and you get good grades, and I don't want to hear it. It wasn't that bad, but that's the sentiment. And I could never have imagined being in a position where I can publicly come and talk about my experiences this way. My advice to the the youth and the students coming up, and the young BIPOC leaders, or people in this space, is that you have every right to be in this space. Do not shrink yourself. And I think because we're not used to seeing ourselves in these spaces, because our voices are not heard, because perhaps the way in which we speak is not seen as professional, and we can get into a whole conversation about what code switching is. We've sort of centered whiteness as being the gold standard. And I would hope that the takeaway is that it's not. You, in all of who you are, belong.
Thank you, Atom. Gabby, would you like to add to that question?
Yeah, like such a big question. I think it really depends, like, on everyone is so different and is overcoming such different challenges. But just keep being loud. Like I love it. You give power back to those of us that weren't able to be as loud as you are. And like the youth that I work with, like they keep me young. Like I'm like 33 now, but I still get ID'd at when I go to the store. And it's not because of actually how I look. I think it's really like the youthfulness that I carry from the young people that I work with. And so it's kind of like this reciprocal relationship, that when we see you doing good and when we see you, pushing down these really great walls and pushing back against this problematic systemic racism, it gives us life also. And it makes all the generations happy. And the one thing too, I always like tell folks that speak different languages aside from like English and French, is that just keep speaking your languages. Your languages are so important. And I'm in the process of like slowly relearning some of the languages that have been stolen from me. And so don't let whiteness steal your languages, because within your languages there's so much medicine and also like instructions and how to live a good way. That's what I find in Indigenous languages in particular. So that's like my advice too, like, don't lose your cultures. There's so much beauty, and, culture is suicide prevention. Cultural dances and songs and language and food, that's all suicide prevention. It's all mental health and well-being. So, you know, don't don't let any of this whiteness take that away from you.
Amazing answers. Well, that's all the time we went over our time, but that is all the time that we have. Gabrielle and Atong, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, experience with us today, and for being part of Taking a Stand. For anyone looking to take part in our final session tomorrow, please check out the Taking the Stand website, which will be posted in our chat. The website has all the times and events descriptions, speaker bios. And then to register, you can refer students and employees to emails that were sent out last week, which include the registration links for all the events. We would like to thank the Truth, Reconciliation, and I am so sorry. I'm talking, I'm like, oh, I'm getting nervous. Indigenization for sponsoring this event today. We want to give a big thank you for all the attendees for coming. Thanks again, everyone, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Miigwech. Hi, hi.